Seinfeld was hanging out at the bar, looked through the window, sees that I'm performing to nobody.
You were so good, but I didn't recognize any of your jokes. Excuse me. Can I quit this podcast?
I told Eddie Murphy to stay in college so he'd have something to fall back on. I did great advice. Jackie, how about the lighter side of history? The lighter side.
I'm done laughing at my joke.
Okay. I know a lot of things and I share them on the podcast and you don't care.
What are we talking about?
I can't get a word in edgewise on this show. I mean, it's...
Here's how we sell it.
Okay.
My friend Red McCready worked with my band, but he didn't really. We never paid him, but I couldn't pay him because there was not one thing he did that I didn't have to redo. If he set up an amplifier, a microphone, a sound system, I had to check everything and usually redo it. So that's not really helping me. And then he got hired at the East Side Comedy Club, and he worked the door for a while. Do you know the story of that? He's working the door, and do you know about the $20 bill?
Do it.
So so he's a hustler. So he would tell people, if you'd like a really good seat, then people would get the idea pretty quick, and they'd hand him a 20 and they'd get a good seat. So the word got back to Richie Minervini, the owner. So Richie took a 20 and gave it to one of his friends, and his friend came in and Red said, "Would you like a good seat?" And, "Oh yeah, well, I could probably help you out." So the guy gave him the 20, and then after the guy sat down, Richie said, "Red, step outside." And they stepped outside, and he said, "Are you shaking people down for tips?" And he goes, "No, of course not." "Take out your wallet." And Red took out his wallet. He said, take out the last 20 you put in your wallet. And on the 20 it said, "You're fired." But so meanwhile, and then he went away to Florida, and he wound up in Florida, and then I spoke to him like a couple of years later, and he was working as a cashier in an all-night gas station. And I said, "What are you up to, Red?" He says, "Well, I'm working as a cashier in an all-night gas station. You know this business we're in." In the course of being pals, me and Peter try not to talk to each other too much because it'll waste what's on the show here, which we hope is interesting. But we stumbled across something. We unearthed something that I didn't know about him, he didn't know about me. And that's old New York history.
Yes.
I don't know who introduced what to who.
You showed me a story about Martling's Tavern.
Right.
Which proves a number of things. You've really got serious alcoholism in your DNA and in your blood.
It was booze and then politics,
And it was an early place where local politicians formed and got their act together and started to establish Tammany Hall, which
Now a question I didn't ask because
Yes.
I wanted to wait till now. When I told you that, and you knew about Tammany Hall and had studied that era, had you heard the term Martling's Tavern?
I had
before?
heard of Martling's Tavern, yes. It was a place, you would have loved it. There was complete and utter debauchery there. Lots of drinking.
That was the back room of Martling's Tavern was called the Long Room.
Right. And
that was the first Tammany Hall.
Right, and the Long Room was named after the way Native Americans had the Iroquois Nation had these long houses that they lived in. It's much more so than the so-called wigwam that you would see
Right, and the
on television.
And there was sachems, and there was a whole
and they patterned all of their rituals after Native American rituals, like the leaders of Tammany Hall were called sachems. Absolutely.
Right. And it was so interesting, and they were called the Martling Men, and they were all drunks and crazy, and but it was politics too. And then they built their own place. And
Yes.
It was there's a couple pages in a book that I have where the day when they took everything and they marched from Martling's Long Room to the brand new, that's the picture I brought for you. Like,
Oh, I love it. I love it.
and what's so great is it says Martling's on the front. Like Jackie put that there himself? But
No,
that's
no,
actually there.
Martling, and that's
And
your
over
blood.
on the
That's
right-
in your blood.
And over on the right is the actual hall. Well, what happened was, Johann Martling came to Staten Island in 1675, and he had, I think, Peter, and Peter had a bunch of kids, and then Peter had Peter, and Peter had Benjamin, and that was my whole line. But we're
So that
branched
line
off.
sounds Dutch.
Oh, absolutely Dutch. And one of Peter's kids was Abraham, and Peter had Abraham, who also had a son named Abraham. There might have been three of them, but Abraham was one of them was a blacksmith, and he was Bram. The nickname
Okay.
for Abraham was Bram,
Uh-huh.
and he had a son named Abraham, and he called him Bones. And Abraham Martling was good friends with Washington Irving, and so Bram Bones in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is based on my ancestor.
I love it. I love it.
But that's actually in the Google, which is really crazy. But then I don't know. I think that was after he had the place. It was at the corner of Nassau and Spruce Street in Manhattan in the late, I think, 1780s.
Yes.
I got to nail it down. But putting all the pieces together, there's a really good chance. There was a whole thing where they were against Clinton, but they were for Aaron Burr, and the different factions of the party were going
DeWitt
this
Clinton, the governor.
way. Right. 'Cause,
Okay, now this is
but
what
let me just
a
finish it.
lineage.
There's
Wow.
a really good chance that after Burr shot Hamilton, they came back and partied at Martling's Tavern, which is not something I want to hang from the chandelier, but
Wow.
you think it's so
I love
crazy
it.
in such a small world, but back then it really was a small world. There were 12 people, there were 12 million. You know what I
Right.
mean?
That was a place where politicians got together to make their bonds, to decide what they were doing, to do good works, and also to get in what they used to call back in those days honest graft. They thought they should get their cut. And that is part of American history for centuries.
Right. Everybody wet their beak and just always did.
But that's such great that you know your Dutch roots. I have waspy white Anglo-Saxon American roots. Jackie, you're not going to believe this. My mother's family came over to this country, and it wasn't even a country yet, on the second ship after the Mayflower, the Anne. And we have a family Bible in our possession to this day, copied over many
I
times.
was scared you were going to say you have a Polaroid photo. of it.
I have a Polaroid photo of it, and I can prove to you that my great whatever grandfather, in approximately the year 1630, was the first person in this land that will one day become the United States of America to be arrested for public drunkenness.
Ah, that's wonderful.
And I'm very proud that in my senior year of college, I was able to achieve a similar destiny and unite myself forever with my illustrious ancestors.
Is that written?
That's
like
written
in the
down.
family Bible?
Yes, and you know who-
on Friday night, Charlie was.
Yeah, our family name that goes back that far, Du Bois, okay? And he, you know who took him into custody? Ye arm of the law. That's the language they spoke back then. It's people, everybody, it's exciting to research your roots. It just is.
It's exciting to research. In old New York, there
right.
was a tavern for every 17 people.
Right.
I mean, it was a tavern house. It was a free for all.
Yeah, it was almost like Huntington, Long Island.
You know,
The most bars on Long Island, Huntington, New York.
researching it was printed up in the old Huguenot Times in like 1930, and I have a copy of this. Our pioneer Johann Martling, and he was given like 40 acres. I should have read this again before I came, but he was given like 40 acres on Staten Island after the English had taken over. The English took over New York in, I think,
Yes.
1675 or something. Right after that, he was given this plot of land on Staten Island. He was a land grantee from the king. And I thought, wow, he was somebody. But then you keep reading and find out
Right.
he was the third person to be given the same parcel of land. Because the first two were wiped out by the Indians. Literally wiped out by the Indians. But
Right.
he made it through.
Well, that's why they built Wall Street, to keep the Native Americans out. It's
Which is
absolutely true.
One of the great when you read that, that's
Right.
one of the great facts.
And the Dutch that you're related to left their mark on New York City. Number one, tolerance, okay? But most of all, Dutch names. Bronx, the Bronx is originally a Dutch name.
Right, right.
Brookloon is originally a Dutch name. We've all driven on Van Dam Street to try to get to the 59th Street Bridge. These references are all over New York. The Dutch were here. They brought us Easter eggs, the game of bowling, those ridiculous wooden shoes.
You know, the craziest thing they brought is they came to Jamestown the people came to Jamestown from England for religious tolerance, and they came to Massachusetts for religious tolerance, and the Dutch came to New York to make money, to get beaver pelts and sell them.
It wasn't even the Dutch government. It was the Dutch,
in that New York
Dutch West
documentary,
India Company. Yep,
it said
you got it.
New York was a colony or whatever, or a fiefdom or whatever it was. New York existed for 17 years before they bothered to build a church, which just tells the tale of.
And eventually they had the Dutch Reformed Church, but they didn't force other people to be in the Dutch Reformed Church like happened in New England. Actually, in Jamestown, a lot of those guys came to make money because they thought they were going to find gold, and they didn't find any gold in the swamps of Virginia. The Indians had all the good land, so the Jamestown settlers settled in the middle of a swamp. No one, and the first winter was called the Starving Time. Well, that'll give you an idea of how it went.
Do you know the whole tale of the missing colony?
Oh, the
missing colony,
lost colony of Roanoke.
Yeah,
Right.
like there was a colony, and we're going to go home and get some people and come back, and they went home and where'd everybody go?
Yeah, it took them 3 years to get back instead of one. And the only sign that they had dropped settlers off on this island, off the coast of modern-day North Carolina, was carved into the tree the word Roanoke, which nobody to this day knows what it means.
I had
they
never
were
heard this
completely
story.
gone.
And when I first met Paul Bernard, who's Tom Bernard's brother, they're very big movie people. His wife, Paul's wife, was from there, and she said, "Well, you know, you're sitting around drinking in between." She says, "Oh, did you ever hear of the missing colony of Roanoke?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, I'll listen to anything." And she started recounting that story, and it's like, it's quite a tale. And then as Google expands and you can go and look, it tells you the whole tale, but it also tells you that they don't know anything.
Well, actually, there's an end to that story, or a pretty good end, I think. If you're an optimist, well, let's be a pessimist first. If you're a pessimist, you think they were attacked by the Native Americans and killed. If you're an optimist, some of them survived and were adopted by the Native Americans.
And just assimilated.
And into the 1800s, I mean 2 centuries later, a Native American woman in that area with a Native American husband would have 4 kids, and one of them would come out white. Right. Which is proof. I mean, that's proof right there.
And that's how it works genetically. The Mendelian cross.
Yes, exactly right. Yes, they were assimilated. They were not wiped out like some of the early textbooks used to say.
And I'm sure they could have wiped out half of them and
right.
kept the women, or
exactly.
wiped out these, but kept some of them.
It was
I
not.
hate to say it, but almost like the Nazis kept some of the Jews
right.
to work, and some of them,
Right. It was not a genteel time. Our founding. In fact,
have you ever stopped? Can you imagine the iron will you had to have? Forget about getting on the boat and coming across the ocean in these tiny boats, but coming to a place where there's nothing. I mean,
there was nothing. There was no 7-Eleven.
You had to really hate.
You had to find your food.
You had to hate where you left.
And that's what makes us Americans to this day. We're so different from Europeans. Europeans centuries earlier, they were fencing in land, don't hunt on the king's land. In America, if you saw somebody's chimney smoke, wow, they're too close, we got to move. And we had 3,000 miles to go. And it didn't matter on the frontier what your last name was or how much money you had. Can you build a cabin under Indian attack? Can you find food?
Can you protect your family?
Can you protect your family? That's what makes Americans hardworking, tough SOBs. And to this day, Americans work longer hours and take less vacations than Europeans do. We're different. We are profoundly different. We move a lot.
I used to walk on the beach every day. And I don't know why I'd get in my head, but I'd be walking on the beach, and all I could think of was stagecoaches, wagon trains going across the country, and there's no roads, and these old wooden wheels, and women having babies, and it's staggering, the thought of what they did, but
how tough it was.
But that's what they did.
That's what they did on these stagecoaches, weeks to get to Boston. We have to get up early if we have a show in Boston.
Right,
That took them weeks. The Oregon Trail, months of hardship. In an age when they didn't understand what germs were. And a doctor was also called Bones, Sawbones.
Right.
And in town, quite often, the barber was also the doctor because he had the sharp tools you would need to amputate a leg that would, if you got a deep cut, it would get gangrene, and they didn't understand what was happening, but they knew they had to prevent that big infection in your leg to spreading.
Anesthesia was a mouthful.
They didn't have
of
it,
booze.
and bite down on this bullet. But they didn't want the infection to spread to a vital organ, so they're doing this up through the Civil War. Deep cut, amputate. But they were saving a person's life by doing that, because as Europe is discovering it first, American doctors did not begin to figure out about germs, little things you can't see that cause infection, until after the Civil War.
And there were doubting Thomases for a long time. I don't know if I'm buying.
Right. I asked my own doctor, what year do you think it actually helped you to go to the doctor in the United States? You're more likely to be helped than harmed. And he said probably the 1930s with the sulfa drugs and the coming of penicillin. And the coming of penicillin. You see it in the great book and movie, All Quiet on the Western Front. If you go to the hospital, they're saying to you, you're dead. We're giving up.
Enter at own risk.
Yeah, and we're sending you to the hospital, and you're on your own. We've given up on you.
Yeah, for the most, we're sending you to the hospital to die.
Right.
Kind of,
Right.
Well,
that's so true.
This is certainly uplifting.
But I love stories of old New York. No electricity. Nobody went out at night. What's best for law enforcement? A light. You forget about that. A light outside. Well, when it's completely
what's best
dark.
for criminals?
Yes.
There's no lights.
There's no lights.
What's
That's
most
so
amazing
totally true.
about the world or the United States or whatever is the minute something's absorbed, it's part of everything. Like trying to remember when there weren't cell phones, or remember when there wasn't internet, or remembering when there wasn't cable TV, or remembering when there wasn't color TV. Like things get, I was listening to this great podcast, and they're talking about how, I don't know, it was 1870, 1880, all of a sudden somebody came up with this incredible concept where they're going to put the voting box behind the curtain so everybody can't see who you're voting for. And
Right.
who would ever, you would think that, of course, that's the way it always was.
That's called the Australian ballot, because that's where the idea came from. Yes, they used to stand in a group. Who's voting for President Jackson? And everybody in a group. Think you're under pressure? Oh boy, I love it.
It's so crazy.
This will crack you up. Your dad was a volunteer firefighter, right? Okay. So in New York City, they were still using volunteer fire departments into the 1850s. And the volunteer fire departments got paid by the fire. So when there was a fire in New York, all the fire departments, the volunteer fire departments, would hear about it and go rushing to the fire.
It was competition.
And then the fire's going, who's going to put out the fire? They would get into a fight over who's going to put out the fire while the building burned down.
When I first heard about that and saw that,
So crazy.
not to finagle a joke into this, but I do cameo.com.
Yes.
And I do a bunch of jokes.
Yes.
You know, if you say, wish my mother a happy birthday, she loves jokes about poop, and she's got 2 obnoxious grandchildren, and I try and do a joke about each thing. So I was doing one the other day, and I live in Bayville, and I'm doing a podcast. I'm doing a cameo, and it's noon. And I'm almost at the end. I do like 2 or 3 minutes for somebody, and all of a sudden, in the middle of it, it's 12 o'clock. The 12 o'clock whistle goes off, and I go, I got to end this. I'm not a fireman, but my girlfriend's husband is, which is a great joke. And I'm sure they thought Jackie timed it so the fire alarm would go off, and it just was spontaneous, you know.
Hey, a new episode of Stand Up Memories every Wednesday.
How exciting is that?
It's starring me, Peter Bales, and right here, Jackie the Joke Man Martling.
Please follow us on social media. Search it out. What is it? MeSpace?
MySpace,
Your space?
TikTok, Instagram, Facebook.
Doodah.